You may remember earlier I talked about one of my favorite directives being the Model Directive. That's what we're going to see here. But first I'd like to further emphasize what we're doing here. By using the input listener and then binding to the value, we're keeping the state out of our DOM and keeping it inside of this data function down here. So all the knowledge of the current state of the component is kept inside of a data function. Just to further emphasize this, I'm going to use a string interpolation and render the value, and you can see as we type, that's going to update immediately. This is what we call two-way binding. We have the value and we have it updating automatically. And this is a very common thing to do, especially with inputs. It's actually so common Vue provides a shorthand, which I'm going to show you now. What we can do is instead of listening to an input event and then binding to a value, we can just remove all of this and use vModel and bind to our value. And what this is going to do is exactly the same thing. It's going to listen for input and update value, and all we have to do is type vModel, and this is going to work exactly the same. Let's go ahead and see how this works. So if we refresh the page, everything is working the same, and our application is still working. So what we just did is effectively eliminate some boilerplate code. We made everything a little bit more concise. One of the really nice things about vModel is it doesn't just work with strings, it works with different kind of inputs. Let's take a look at that now. I'm going to change this to be a checkbox input, and we're going to see how this one works now. Instead of making the value a string, of course it's a checkbox, so this is going to be a Boolean value. I'm going to make this one false by default. And if we save that off, we can see it's now false, but if we check it, it's going to update and become true automatically. What's happening here is we're just updating the value from false to true, and then we're going to render the new value in the DOM. And that's going to work out of the box. And this is really useful because this kind of two-way binding is very common when you have forms that are highly dynamic, and you'd like to have some validation and that sort of thing. So we've seen it working with checkboxes, but it also works with other things like radio groups. Let's go ahead and see that as well. I'm going to create two radio buttons, and these are both going to be radio, and then we're going to bind to the same thing, vModel, and we're just going to give these a default value. So I'm going to say the value is going to be A here, and the value is going to be B here. Let's go ahead and refresh this, and we can see we have two of these, but having a true-false value doesn't make a whole lot of sense for radio inputs. We're going to have to change that. So let's just jump down here, and we're going to default this one to A, and if we save that, it's going to start off with A, and if I change this to be B, it's going to update the binding as well. Of course, the error message is always going to be too short because A and B are always going to be less than 7 characters, so don't worry about that. The main point here is we're dynamically updating which option is selected. Let's go ahead and see this working with a group of checkboxes as well. So I'm just going to delete this error, we don't need this one anymore. And instead of using radio here, we're going to head back and use checkbox again. In this case, we're going to have two, and they're both going to be using vModel on the same checkbox. Let's go ahead and update the value now. Again, we're using multiple checkboxes here, so it might not make much sense to use a value. We're going to have an array of values. Let's save this one off and see what happens. And we're also going to have to interpolate the value just to see what's happening. So now you can see A is selected by default, and that array has one entry, the A character. And if we click on this one, we're going to have both A and B. And this is really powerful. Doing this yourself using JavaScript and manipulating the DOM is very error prone, and it's quite a lot of code. And you see we were able to accomplish it here using just a single line of code using vModel, and everything is just going to work for us out of the box. So we can use vModel for other kinds of inputs like select and for text areas. We're going to see that later on, but for now I think that's enough. What we're going to do now, we've seen all the basics of Vue.js, is move on to seeing something called components, and then finally see something called a single file component, which is another one of my favorite features and the most common way to write Vue.js applications.